Elioaux here with the Eorzean archives. Holy crap, what a trailer. I'm going to go over the lore and things that were immediately apparent to me, or that we had guessed at in the 6.1 trailer. So, let's dive in. We immediately start with Tataru talking to us, sort of about being lonely. She states she's not pining for our return. During this flash to the other Scions, we see Y'shtola surrounded by books, likely somewhere in the Numenon, maybe even the restricted section in which G'raha was venturing into during Endwalker. Urianger and G'raha seem to be standing in and around where the Ragnarok is, and interestingly enough, G'raha seems to be somewhere in Thavnair. But all of that isn't the most interesting part. It's not even really much of a beginning. No, where the real interest gets going is when we see Estinian and a group of treasure hunters who seem to have a map to some lost ruins somewhere nearby Thavnair. We can tell because the islands they seem to be going to, you look at their structures and it's all Thavnairian. Now this means that they could be somewhere like Uznair to the south, or it could be the sunken city in the Bounty that Emmett Selk references in Endwalker. Assuming that, it's more likely that this region is either to the northeast or the northwest of Thavnair. My money would be to the northwest, as to the northeast is the Corvos Narrows, the Ridderan Cataract, and it's kind of already a clumped up region. But it could be anywhere. The map that we see isn't necessarily Thavnair proper, and seeing as we can't see the mainland, it's probably a reference point to all these islands, and traveling about to them. If this is somewhere in the Corvos Narrows, it would act as a really helpful gateway for us to go to Corvos at some point, which is touched on a whole bunch of Endwalker, and is the origin place of Garleans. Well, that's kind of a misnomer, but functionally for them it is. Estinian has the line that the map may or may not be genuine. Now, that may be misleading, or the fact that our next shot seems to be the dungeon and vast riches may be telling us that, well, no, it is real. Speaking of, the area that we see is very similar to a lot of Thavnairi architecture, as well as some Uznarian architecture. But most important of all is when we see that we are actually underwater. The fact that we're underwater really helps support the idea that this is actually the lost city in the Bounty that Emmett Selk was referencing, acting as a sort of Thavnairi Atlantis. All the following shots only really work to reinforce this idea. The boss that we see even has a minion for it that we saw during the live letter, and the design behind it looks quite similar to warding scales. While the next footage we see is merely crystalline conflict, the line that we get from Varshan/Vritra is an echo of what he gives us in Endwalker: take heart and protect them well. But the following lines of him failing to live up to them seems to imply that either one of the Scions or people we knew is either in danger or suffering in some capacity. It's been a plot element even on to 5.3 that Y'shtola was trying to find a way between the reflections and the source with regularity, something that not only did Endwalker touch on explicitly itself, but also anytime you would see her out in the open world talking to her, which she implied was her primary mission. So, when we get to this point in the trailer where she's talking about reflections and finding a path between them and the source, it's of no surprise. The question really is, will this be for 7.0? I don't think so. I think it far more likely that 7.0 will be Mericidia or the New World, as the focus on the terrestrial seems far more in line with what Yoshi P seems to have had planned for adventuring in the world that we know, and expanding its borders. Having spent the two past expansions either in some kind of other world or a lot of it out and beyond our own star, it seems to make sense that 7.0 will be then the New World or Mericidia. But that brings into question what 8.0 will be. On top of this, there's multiple storylines pertaining to other reflections, not only the first, but the restoration of the 13th, that have had seeds laid for them well in advance, even before 5.0 and even really as early as 3.0. We also get Fortunel talking to the leaders of the other nation-states. This is super important as it shows Sharlayan actively reaching out and connecting with the rest of the world, which is going to be very important for the world state going forward. On top of this, it seems to be bringing the role quest as a whole to a climax, and will be a really interesting series of quests both from a character and larger lore perspective. The fact that they're entering the Tower of Babel at all is interesting, seeing as Anima is already dealt with, and in theory there should be no lingering presence to contend with. This may not be the case though. Hildebrand ending up in the first is a fascinating thing. The fact that he glows seems to imply that he was summoned as a byproduct of Elidibus's actions during 5.3, and somehow ended up stuck there. Which is further interesting as how it might relate to the themes of Y'shtola's focus on finding a way to the reflections. Y'shtola referencing looking for hints seems vital as she's going into the archives under Numenon, which would tell us that there are many secrets there and or maybe possibly some entries from long-dead scholars, Neomkrumpf maybe, or even Hydaelyn herself, that could tell us how to reach between the reflections on a regular basis, or even crafting a regular bridge. She even references not finding simple instructions tucked away in some dark corner of the library. One can't help but wonder if we're being trolled here and such a thing actually might exist. We then get a shot of the tribal quests, and specifically of Ogul being a part of it, which is really meaningful as she started out deeply afraid of Matanga and is now participating in their entire civilization. Another really important factor here is that there seems to be a race going on between the Arkasodra and the Gadrasudra, which the Gadrasudra are the ones that have caused the Auri to fear the Matanga as a whole, and so there may be a much more complicated and nuanced story going on here. We then see 3 men in black robes praying to what seem to be void scent statues and trying to bring them forth, which again ties to Reflections and the 13th. Now, while these could be Lambs of Dalamud, as the area they're within seems to be like the Tamtara Deepcroft, and that would make a lot of sense, especially with void scent, the fact that they're black robed rather than red robed seems to me to imply that they may actually just be the remnants of black masked Asians. We see Varshan blasting a beam of light and what is probably Aether. One can't help but wonder what he might be contending with that would require so much energy and power to fight. I couldn't quite speculate, but it does seem to be tied to his feelings of failing to protect someone, and either trying to make amends or the failure in its own right. Then we get to the real meat and crux of it, something that we've been theorizing and talking about for a long time. The Heaven of Lightning, and the location of at least parts of Myths of the Realm. The Heaven of Lightning is really important. The 12, the gods of Eorzea, are the fundamental entities, and of the 12, each has a paired elemental alignment. So, there is, for the lightning aspect of Aether, Byrago and Ralgar, who we're about to see in a moment. For the fire aspect, there's Azima and Naldal, which will also play into what we're about to get to. The Heaven and Hells of Lightning is something that we've known about for a very long time, as far back as Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1, and really, frankly, even before that within the game. Now, why this matters is because it's always been elusive as to whether or not the 12 were actual beings or based off / misunderstandings of historical figures. A side note to that, the thing that we see that arrived over Kartnau and attempted to stop Bahamut was not the 12. It was a primal of the 12 as a single entity brought about by the collective faith and belief of Eorzea. Therefore, the 12 as a whole are something that we have never actually experienced or witnessed, which is why Myths of the Realm is so important, as we finally at last see who and what they are, or we'll at least begin on our journey to discover that. An important thing to know about the Heaven of Lightning that's interesting is that there's white griffin imagery everywhere as well as the color purple. Why that matters is because those are also tied to Alamigo, whose patron deity is Ralgar, and therefore it's possible that this symbology made its way down to Alamigo as a progression of reality became mythology. The first boss we see is a man with a hammer. It's clearly Byrago, the smith. You can even see his symbol on the heads of each of the hammers, and who claims that we should witness the glory of the divine. Now, if these characters are ancients themselves, that seems kind of interesting, and the question is to where the heavens exist in physical space. There are 2 distinct possibilities. The heavens either exist in the Unsundered world or the Sundered world. If they exist in the Unsundered world, it's a bit confusing as to why it's in Alliance Raid with 24-man and how everyone seems to arrive there. But what's also possible is that we know remnants of buildings and places survived the Sundering themselves, and that these installations could have made their way into the Sundered world and still exist. This will also tie into imagery we see later and something that we know from 1.0 about Silvertear Lake. Having moved on from the Heaven of Lightning, we see the Heaven of Fire, domain of Azima and Naldal. Speaking of Silvertear Lake, we get a shot of the Warrior of Light and Grahatia walking over the waters of Silvertear Lake. You can tell from the background by the crystals, the waters, and the wreckage of Midgard Summer and the Agrius. What's important here is we've known since 1.0 there was always supposed to be some sort of being or some secret locked away beneath Silvertear Falls. We also know that's what Midgard Summer is supposed to be protecting. The fact that they're traveling over it could be tied to the MSQ, or it could be tied to Myths of the Realm, and lead us to where the heavens and or hells were. This is also important because it is the place we first witnessed Vana, so it has a tight association with Hydaelyn herself. We then see the Heaven of Fire, except for now bathed in moonlight. The fact that we don't see Minfina or any other representations of the moon anywhere else makes me think that this is supposed to be maybe an embodiment of the Hell of Fire rather than the Heaven, and we'll see a dichotomy between the locations of their Heaven and Hell forms. And then we see Azima herself, the Warden. The symbology of her fans, the sun in her hair, all of these are clear representations of her. The thing that's always been interesting about Azima is the closeness with which her name matches Azem. However, that does not necessarily mean that she is representational of that character, as there are other characters who share close names and are derivation of myths all throughout Final Fantasy XIV. Azim, for instance, more likely being a reference to Bahamut himself as the Dawnworm, rather than Azim. If we follow Niniri's theory that the Convocation is representational of the 12, what's quite possible is not that they are the literal entities, but that these installations or places were created as some form of experiment or idea by the ancients, and now what we're seeing is the remainder of this thing. Azima's voice herself might be that of Vanna's, and seeing as Vanna was once the Traveler and the role of Azim, that would also make a lot of sense. However, I do not personally hear it, but the much stronger connection is those who have connected Naldal and Emmett Selk, whose voice seems eerily similar, but we'll touch on that in a second. We then see Ralger's reach, his open palm, and Ralger himself standing within. Ralger being the Magus and Lord of Destruction, his visage matches everything we've known of him so far, and really, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of comet-based spells in the upcoming Alliance raid. It then immediately cuts to what seems to be the twin deities Naldal, possibly as one, represented in the Heaven of Fire. There's also some interesting parallels between that representation and Hades, further connecting the ideas of Naldal representing Emmett Selk. We then seem to be in what seems more explicitly of Hell of Fire, as a being of darkness breaks through a portal. Its voice is quite garbled in English, and I'm sure someone in a different language might have made it out more clear, but what it seems to be referring to is in some way returning, and that would imply that perhaps the 12 and the installations as a whole were actually meant to keep this thing bound. What could be so evil or terrifying that it required this amount of effort to keep sealed is something that we may not have an easy point of reference to guess for. Then we see Nald and Thal, Nald with his coin and Thal with his flames. This twin deity being one of the representations of fire is kind of obvious, and therefore it seems that the Alliance raid will be set up going 4, 4, and 4, with the first two being the 2 of lightning and 2 of fire. That leaves the 2 gods of wind, 2 gods of water, 2 gods of ice, and 2 gods of earth. And while the orders of their operations might be unguessable in a sense, if we look at the Eorzean Wheel of the 12, it goes lightning, fire, notice a pattern here, that is the same order that we've been shown so far, earth, wind, water, and ice. So, if we assume this pattern holds, it would be likely that the next set of 2 would be Earth, so Althik and Nafka, and then Oshan and Limlane. Assuming the lines are attributed to it, Naldal says, "So this is the spirit of man," which to me implies that it's clearly not a representation of actual ancients, but beings created to do a service or job, possibly by the ancients. The final lines we get, "Come mortals, enter my realm if you dare," seem to be coming from Azima, and would then perfectly represent her dominion over the Heaven of Fire. Thanks for joining me as I turn a 3-minute video into something that's over 15 minutes long. This is not a full breakdown of the trailer for 6.1, and we'll have something far more comprehensive in the near future. I hope it's helpful, and we'll have more content talking about 6.1 and what's coming next very soon. With all of that said, thanks for watching all. See you on Atheris. This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday, and comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.